Today on StoryCube, a special true crime episode revisits France's biggest criminal cases. Those who made history, those we've forgotten, and those that still haunt us a century later. But this time, we're not alone. We're joined by a man who spends his days staring the dead in the eyes. Bruno Foligny, a historian specializing in true crime and an expert in criminal archives. For years, he delved into the dusty basements of French justice, where forgotten files sleep, yellowed photographs, and the faces of those no one ever wanted to see again. Murderers, rapists, child killers, women who erased their victims to take their place. All frozen for eternity in a cold snapshot under harsh light facing the police camera. But the question that haunts this book and will concern us in this episode is, can we truly read crime on a face? Does evil leave a mark, an invisible scar in the eyes? Or do the worst monsters wear the most ordinary mask? Some faces make your blood run cold, while others reveal nothing, and that's what's most terrifying. Tonight, Bruno Foligny opens his most disturbing archives, the faces of murderers who have marked the history of crime in France. Dumollard, the servant killer; Landru, the monster with the face of an office worker; Wehler, who stole the identities of her victims; and her children, with eyes too gentle, who killed. Portraits that pose a dizzying question. Who are you when no one is watching? Make yourself comfortable, turn off the lights, and get ready to dive into the forbidden archives, where every face hides a secret and the truth is never found where you expect it. Welcome to StoryCube.
Hello everyone, welcome to StoryCube. Today we welcome Bruno Foligny, a historian who recently wrote an absolutely amazing book. And today, he's here to talk to us about it, to talk about his journey and discuss the biggest cases in this book. Before we begin, could you briefly explain what this book is about?
So this book is called Gueule d'Assassin, and it's a book that looks back on ultimately 2 centuries of photography. The bicentennial of photography is near, but here the focus is photography used for investigation. After photography was invented in the mid-19th century, magistrates and police officers quickly took interest. First, they gathered existing photos, then gradually began taking their own. They photographed victims, they photographed corpses, and eventually they ended up photographing people who were arrested so they could be recognized later. And little by little, it became normalized under the influence of Alphonse Bertillon. They started taking the famous anthropometric face profile photos, what Americans call a mugshot.
What is it actually for? We see it everywhere on television and in real life, but why?
The idea is to be able to recognize repeat offenders. If you take an artistic photo, obviously there are a lot of biases. If you stand one way like this, another way like that, if you make faces, which of course criminals used to do to try to make themselves unrecognizable. Obviously photography is of less use in police work, and Bertillon will develop a special bench with a methodology always the same.
So Bertillon invented
He's the one who invented what we call anthropometry.
Bertillon, the obsession with measurements, a time when people thought crime could be read in numbers. The distance between the eyes, the shape of the skull, the length of the nose, cold, geometric, almost mechanical records. Criminal anthropometry, when science thought it could predict who would become a murderer.
That is, starting in 1883, he developed a system to identify repeat offenders. First, it's bone measurements. He believes that after the age of 20, a certain number of measurements of the human body and the ratios between these measurements no longer change. And so you can get arrested several times under aliases, under different names. Measuring the human body lets us confirm, no, it's the same person, we have his record. He created a card filing system that lets you find information quickly. And quite quickly, he will add photographs to these records and photographs that are taken in a scientific way. His main goal, which also interests me, is to ban the artistic side and take purely objective photos. The face from the front and in profile, always at the same distance and lighting with no background or cast shadows. But today, when we view these photos, they're actually beautiful. And because of their simplicity, their radical nature, they have a very strong emotional impact. And so that's what interested me. It's about how, over 2 centuries, artistic photography evolved into anthropometric photography, which has now become an art form itself.
You mention numerous photos in this book and often discuss cases closely linked to them. That's the idea. Early on, especially in chapter 1, you discuss a killer who lures servants into the woods to rob them. What actually happens with this case?
Dumollard, the killer of servants. February 1855, Lyon. Young servants vanish as a man approaches them on the Guillotière Bridge. He promises a well-paid job in Ain, 200 francs a year. They follow him on foot, but they will never return. On February 26, 1855, Marie Badet's mutilated body is found buried alive. The judge has the corpse photographed. It's a first in judicial history. Martin Dumollard, the first serial killer in France, at least 12 assaults and 3 proven murders.
The Dumollard case occurred during the Second Empire in the mid-19th century. It's significant. First, because he is the first known serial killer in France. In the mid-19th century, people didn't use the term serial killers. That's a modern concept.
Yeah.
But in retrospect, we know that there was a French serial killer named Martin Dumollard. That's what we called him anyway. His real name was Dumollard. He was partly Hungarian on his father's side. We later learned his father was also a criminal. At first, he looked like a good-natured peasant. We're in the Dombes in the Aisne department, not far from Lyon, but in a rural area. And in 1855, some hunters in a forest, the Montauvergne woods, were surprised to discover a corpse. And what a corpse! A beautiful young woman, completely naked with her head all covered in blood. She was killed by a blow to the head, stripped of all her belongings and clothes and left in the woods. And this discovery is important in the history of the police investigation because the investigating judge who comes to handle the case has the idea to have the body photographed.
That wasn't common then, was it?
It was never done. You have to realize that in 1855, photography was still a relatively recent invention, and it was also very expensive. It was mostly the notables, members of the imperial family, or very wealthy people who had their photographs taken, or the upper middle class. You'd have only one photo of yourself for your whole life. In addition, there was a lot of equipment involved and so on. And then he had a photographer brought in from Lyon who came with his equipment. Well, not exactly in the woods, though. We didn't yet have the idea of preserving the crime scene. We were going to move the body. And the body is strangely staged on the square in front of the village church. So, you have to imagine this naked woman who is arranged in a somewhat artistic pose. It evokes certain old paintings. Well, it's a very disturbing photo.
Okay.
And she's going to be photographed. She'll be photographed not just for a macabre picture, but so this unidentified girl, unknown to anyone in the village, might be recognized through the portrait. So, there will be prints made that will circulate and they will be attached to the missing person notice. Sharing photos when someone disappears or a body is found feels normal today, but in 1855 it was revolutionary.
So, do they distribute the photo of the person's corpse then? I mean...
That's right. A wild photo. They didn't distribute it because the press couldn't reproduce photos back then. So these are really photographic prints that are given to the police, which will first be shown to the local residents. Do you know this person? No. And then later, when we start to understand a bit more about the details of the case, we'll show it in Lyon. And a lady will say, well, yes, I recognize her. She was my maid, Marie Badet. She was 22 years old. She left me because she found a better position in the countryside. And we'll realize that, in fact, in Lyon, there's a farmer who seems a bit clumsy, a bit simple, who approaches young maids, the little servant girls, to tell them, look, I come on behalf of my master, who has a beautiful castle. He's looking for a maid, but I already have a job. Yes, but he pays well, you know. He offers nearly double what a maid in Lyon earns. So at that point, the young woman still listens a little more closely. He tells her about free milk, good meals, and more. So what does the little maid do? She packs her bundle, taking her jewelry, savings, and all her belongings. She follows him from Lyon to the countryside, a trip that should normally take all day. First a water coach, then after that they walk a little, and then they walk and they walk. As day fades and night falls, they're in the middle of the forest or a field. And it will happen several times that the young maids, realizing at the last moment that they've fallen into a trap, abandon their belongings, run away, and go banging on the doors of farmhouses. And Judge Guénaud, who already had the good idea to have the body photographed, will also systematically track down these young maids and question them. And he will create, well, at that time they didn't talk about police sketches, a description of this person who obviously repeatedly uses this method. At one point, a maid realizes just in time what is about to happen to her. She sees the man looking for a stone on the ground or trying to pull a stake from a vineyard to hit her with it. She leaves and abandons everything like the others. But her, in addition, she had a very heavy trunk. And the next day, when they return to the scene of the attempted assault, the trunk is gone. That means, since the trunk was very heavy, that the guy lives nearby.
Yeah.
We're going to show the guy's description. He has a lip defect. A local innkeeper says, that's Dumollard, he lives over there. So we go. And then there's a search and they find hundreds of women's clothes, little pieces of jewelry, objects he had kept at his place and made his wife wear because he was married.
His wife, did she know about this?
Apparently. Well, in any case, she must have suspected that all those nice clothes, all those jewels she got from the city weren't earned by her husband's rather questionable work. She even accuses him at one point. She will reveal that besides the assaults, well, he also killed, and she will reveal the location where he buried one of his victims. It will also turn out that the victim was buried alive because they found her hands clenched, trying to get out of the pit where she was thrown. And then, well, at first, Dumollard was arrested for an attempted assault, the maid who left her trunk. But thanks to the photo and the identification of the first body, Marie Badet, 1855, they'll also be able to charge him with murder. And that changes everything. He'll be guillotined. So, this photo from 1855 is fundamental because it's the first time a photograph plays a role in a police investigation. And it will lead to the death sentence of Dumollard. He will be executed in Montluel, in Ain. Since executions were public at the time, it will be a moment of great spectacle. And then he will be buried in the Montluel cemetery, but in the main alley, so that everyone tramples on his body when going to the cemetery. And for decades, there will be a ritual. Every time a maid, a young servant girl, passed through Montluel, she would throw a stone at the spot where Dumollard was buried. It started a tradition that lasted for decades. Today it no longer exists, and Dumollard's head, after his guillotining, is not buried. It was sent to Lyon to be studied, because it was the time when doctors and scientists were wondering if there was a bump of crime, if there was a part in the brain that predisposed someone to murder. They're going to dissect her head, examine her brain, and tan her skin. So in 1985, long after the events, they reconstructed her head from tanned skin using cranial measurements. And today you can see Dumollard's head in a museum in Rieux-la-Pape, the Testut-la-Target Museum.
That's a good question, though it's not really related. But in the end, is there really a killer's face? Is there a certain look? Or is there a typical profile that we could recognize? Or in the end, is that all just a myth?
Well, that's actually a debate that went on throughout the 19th century. At first, people looked for the criminal bump.
What's the criminal bump? Is it just a bump somewhere?
Let's say that now we know there are in the brain, how should I put it, parts of the brain that are more or less specialized in movement, in processing vision, and so on. We wondered if, like a math bump, there might also be a criminal bump. There might be a part of the brain whose hypertrophy would mean, watch out, this individual is dangerous.
Yeah.
And we even wondered if this bump might actually show up as a bump on the skull itself. Some research was done and it makes us smile, but there were scientists who measured the skulls of criminals, the skulls of people who were guillotined, to try to see if there was a trait that would allow them to spot or even anticipate crime. And in particular, well, there's a name to mention. It's an Italian, Cesare Lombroso, who developed the theory of the born criminal. And for him, criminals, with a few exceptions, are degenerates. So he lived in the 19th century. He was immersed in both the theories of evolution and the racist theories that were prevalent at the time, where human types were somewhat ranked in a hierarchy. He sees criminals as evolutionary failures, like prehistoric men living among us. And so they have a kind of animality, a violence that is completely determined by their brain, by their body. And so they are identifiable. And so he wrote some completely crazy pages. And of course, when the theory fails.
Well, yeah, that's it.
In other words, a criminal can look friendly and have a good face. He says, yes, but here it's different. It's an intelligent criminal with other flaws. In fact, it's a theory that doesn't hold up, but it's going to occupy the congresses and scholars of the time a lot. Until the French school, a doctor like Lacasson and then someone like Bertillon, well, they start working differently. And they won't try to find a bump of crime or the typical face of a murderer, a born criminal. Instead, they will emphasize the environment's influence. But it's true that when you look at these photos, if you analyze them kind of with a bit of distance, you see all sorts of things. You don't necessarily see the face of a murderer, but you do see someone's social background, by their clothing, of course, but also by a number of physical marks that may have been caused by cold, hunger, certain types of work, and so on. You also need to realize that photos that seem sinister in the end, they are taken after arrest and interrogation, which in the 19th century was still quite harsh. You or I, given the same treatment,
Yeah, that's it. Everyone looks like a murderer.
we would really look like murderers too.
Yeah, that's right. Speaking of looking like a murderer, the Samson case is interesting.
The crime that looks like poverty, a face damaged by hunger, the streets, alcohol, nothing like a great criminal, just a man crushed by misery. His portrait still chills us today, revealing the raw truth of the underworld. Paris, late 19th century. A poor man's crime in a world of the poor.
The Samson case is at its core a rather sordid affair, but there's this quite extraordinary photo where Samson and his accomplice Geoffroy are both standing, surrounded by the police officers who arrested them. Given the exposure times back then, it means they took the time to face the camera. Samson stands proudly, even while facing the death penalty and knowing it, with a slightly defiant expression. His accomplice, who is a bit older, is more reserved and is starting to realize that things are going to go badly. But there's this photo, which isn't scientific at all. In this case, it's really a very rare artistic photo of two criminals. You could even say two murderers and law enforcement officers posing together. So the case takes place in a suburb of Saint-Nazaire. This is what was called the Immaculée crime. All right, they targeted a farmer who lived in that suburb. They shouted fire, making him believe that an outbuilding of his house was on fire. So the old man went outside. He was an old guy. They both jumped on him. They beat him up badly, then went into his house.
So that means there wasn't actually a fire at all. They just called him out.
It was just so he would open his door, you know. Back then, people would barricade themselves in at night, you know. There wasn't much public lighting. We knew it was dangerous, so we didn't just go out carelessly at night in the suburbs of big cities. He hears someone shout fire and sees two young men signaling that there's a fire where he stores his hay and equipment. For a farmer, that's serious, so he acts in good faith, but it was a trap, a trick. He opened his door, they pushed him back inside and kept hitting him, simply to make him reveal where his savings are. This was in 1899. French peasants then were hesitant to save in banks, fearing they might go bankrupt any day. It's better to have a tin box with money in it. He'll eventually admit where he put his wallet, which has 24 francs. Well, even if the franc was convertible to gold at the time, it's still not a fortune. But for them, it's enough.
What's that roughly today?
Around 300 euros today.
Okay, all right.
It's not much. Later, the investigation will reveal he also had 1,400 francs saved in his nightstand. And those two low-level thugs didn't even see it, actually.
Yeah.
They beat him up and kill him, then place him on his bed. To destroy the evidence, they set fire to the mattress straw.
Yeah.
Which in the end is stupid, because now there's really a fire started by them, and so it's going to reveal the crime and trigger an investigation. Besides, these two thugs are actually known in the neighborhood, so pretty quickly the investigation will lead back to them. So they're arrested and they're going to be photographed and then guillotined, and that's when they enter the history of the guillotine. Because after the photographer who takes their portrait, they have to deal with another photographer. Photographer was the nickname given to the executioner's assistant who held the heads of the condemned once they were laid on the board before the blade fell to prevent them from pulling back. It was an unpleasant and dangerous job. You had to hold them by the ears or by the hair during the few seconds when the blade, as they called it, the guillotine, cut the body in two. And since there are two of them, they are guillotined one after the other. And normally you obviously remove the first head before proceeding with the next execution. Here it's early in the morning, the executioner's assistants are distracted, and so our friend Samson, when he falls, lets out a scream of horror because he sees at the bottom of the basket the severed head of his accomplice. And this will come up again at the cemetery, since Samson's mother wants to recover the body and therefore her son's head in order to bury him. The executioner picks a head from the basket saying, "This is the one," and the woman faints. This will earn the executioner a reprimand from his administration, because obviously that's not the proper way to proceed.
Well, yeah, of course, that's crazy. Has it ever happened to you, maybe during your research, I don't know, to come across a portrait of an anti-criminal? It seems to me that in the book, for example, you talk about the Prévost case. Is that the case, for example, where you see a portrait and you think, but actually, No, him. That's not possible. He couldn't be a criminal, I mean.
Prévost, the shocking ordinary face. February 27, 1876, Paris, 18th District Mardi Gras, Sunday, 2 p.m. Victor Prévost strangles the Blondin girl, dismembers her, puts the pieces in the sewers, and leaves the head at the fortifications. The most chilling part, Prévost isn't a typical criminal. He's a decorated former cuirassier and medal recipient. And above all, he's a peacekeeper, a policeman who kills in the neighborhood he's supposed to protect. A national scandal.
At first, Victor Prévost is above all suspicion. This is the 19th century. He's a man of very strong build with a fine pair of mustaches who was very successful with women in his neighborhood. They called him the handsome man. And not only is he good looking, but also in his youth, he was an assistant butcher. By the way, he's a big meat eater. He's a guy with a strong build and the gluttony that goes with it. He's quite a bon vivant. And then pretty quickly, he first made a career in the army. He was a cuirassier, a cavalryman who wore a metal breastplate and helmet. He was even part of what was called the 100 Guards, which was an elite squadron responsible for the security of Napoleon III.
Okay.
After leaving the army, he joined the police and became a peace officer in Paris, also wearing a uniform. So he's a man who looks very pleasant. The shopkeepers and the maids are crazy about him. He's being courted from all sides. He has his uniform, he belongs to the police. So basically no problem.
Yeah.
What happens is that one night near Porte de la Chapelle, in an alley that at the time was called Rue du Pré-Maudit, now it's just Rue du Pré, it still exists, but they removed the word Maudit, Rue du Pré-Maudit. You see a man doing something strange. It looks like he's throwing packages into a manhole.
Okay.
And so there's a lady, a local resident, who sees this, and she's a bit surprised and she feels like she knows this guy. After he leaves, she checks and is horrified, then alerts a neighbor. Because these packages, actually, they're packages of meat in a way. It's bloody well, and I'll spare you the details. But we're going to open these packages, we're going to ask for the opinion of a doctor, of a pharmacist.
Does he take off when he sees the woman coming, or?
No, he just dropped off the packages and left. She cautiously waited for him to leave before checking what he was doing. He had no reason to throw things into a manhole. There were already trash bins, as we called them then, not yet garbage cans. And so we realized that, in fact, those are pieces of a human body that this man is getting rid of. So, of course, the police are alerted. They question the lady and she says, listen, this may sound strange to you, but this man who was in civilian clothes, I feel like I've already seen him in uniform. You know, it's the very handsome officer everyone calls the handsome man around here. The police are surprised. It can't possibly be a colleague who did this, but just to be sure, since he's been identified by this lady, they're going to question him. And then he makes a big mistake. He says, Pré-Maudit Street, but I don't even know where that is. Now his chief is suspicious since Pré-Maudit Street is in the area he's supposed to patrol. So he can't possibly not know that street. And we even know that a few months earlier, he arrested a petty criminal there. So he's lying. Why is he lying? And so little by little we investigate and realize in 1879 that this police officer, Victor Prévost, had a jewelry broker over at his place. A sort of salesman actually, who wanted to sell him watches, gold jewelry and so on. So it's a kind of traveling merchant who came with a box full of samples. So little gold jewelry, watch chains, watches and so on. And actually Victor Prévost, who was also inspecting the area around the Gare du Nord tracks. He had taken a tension ball, which is a tool used by railway workers, and it's a huge cast iron ball with a handle. He used that to, I was going to say, knock out, but actually to brutally kill this jeweler, Lenoble. Then, using a large kitchen knife, he dismembers him. And so it's the pieces of this stripped jeweler that he's trying to get rid of after draining the blood in the bathtub. Really a heinous crime. So obviously a police officer doing that, you can imagine the scandal. And so those with good memories think that's strange because 3 years earlier he had a close friend, almost a fiancé, who mysteriously disappeared right after she inherited money. And they investigate again and realize that he did the same thing 3 years earlier with his own girlfriend, who was also killed, dismembered, robbed, and so on.
Both times, just for a fortune, right?
Oh, a fortune. Actually, it's not even a fortune, because whether it's his fiancée or the jeweler, Lenoble, it's a small amount of money, but he actually had an unhealthy attraction to gold and metal. He's uninterested in money or gems, only in jewelry, watches, and gold chains. He's someone who wasn't very, how should I say, not very rational, Prévost.
No kidding?
And so he's arrested. He's sentenced to death pretty quickly. He's set to be guillotined in Paris, and his reported last words at the guillotine were, "I ask forgiveness from the administration."
That's crazy. Has your research ever led you to criminal children or photos of them doing such things? At one point, for example, you talk about the Neuilly gang in the book. Is that, for example, the case, or...
The Neuilly gang, neighborhood thugs ahead of their time, 1900 Paris suburbs. Here are the gang's first photos. Insolent, provocative kids defy public order. There aren't professional robbers, just youths playing with the law. First look at juvenile delinquency, first moral panic.
So there are photos of children, including anthropometric photos. It's quite rare because since growth isn't finished, the interest in terms of anthropometry isn't obvious. But when children are caught in the act, and especially for crimes indeed starting from the 19th century, there are photographs taken. You can find some photos like that. What I find quite harsh is when you have the same photo of the child and the adult.
Yeah.
Someone who stayed a delinquent, what changes is their eyes. You recognize the face, even if it's gotten heavier, but above all, the face has hardened. At first, there's a look, how should I say, a little curious, a little surprised, like a street kid. Years later, you see the hardened criminals in different look, no longer caring about repeated anthropometry or judicial identification. That's what you see. The Neuilly gang, however, are adults, not kids. It's actually a rather peculiar gang, because it's a gang that doesn't just include thugs, but also people who at first glance have a bourgeois or petit bourgeois appearance. And in particular, there's even a funeral home director who, as a result, probably managed to slightly increase his turnover. He actually identified wealthy people living alone to the thugs. And that's how a loan shark named Olivier, this is in 1892 by the way, gets a visit from criminals at his home at night who literally tie him up, torture him to death to make him reveal where his savings are. And so the gang will then be identified and dismantled. All those people will end up in prison. But what's really striking is that some members of this gang are completely unsuspected based on their appearance.
Yeah. Was the gang big?
Oh, there are about 10 people.
Oh yeah, that's quite a few.
No, it's a real gang, it's a real gang. There's a leader named Paul-André with his brother who runs the gang. A funeral director appears totally calm, like a seasoned businessman. And then he has two real thugs who are going to be the ones responsible for the torture and the particularly gruesome murder of this loan shark. They're not very careful, so the gang will get caught fast and everyone will rat each other out. This gang won't last long.
By pretty quickly? Do you mean within a few months?
Yes, that's right.
A few months?
That's right. But we're in a time when Neuilly isn't what we know today. By the late 19th century, it's less populated with scattered houses. So, well, there you go. To break into people's homes, to torture them until they reveal where they hide their gold coins, it's ideal, especially if you have a good informant on site.
It's funny, at that time, so that was mainly it, the crimes. It was mostly people breaking into someone's house to ask them where the money was hidden. A bit like today when someone robs a bank, or I don't know.
Well, today's saucissonneurs didn't invent anything new. They're basically repeating a kind of crime that used to target, I'd say, somewhat bourgeois people who had isolated houses, either isolated or surrounded by a large garden. There shouldn't be nearby neighbors to raise the alarm. Also in the countryside, it was sometimes the wealthier farms. Farmers didn't trust banks with their money, which led to this type of crime. It wasn't the only one, though. And if we go back a little in time, there were what we called the chauffeurs. Chauffeurs broke into homes, lit a fire in the fireplace, and burned the soles of your feet, causing intense pain. And so they would burn the soles of people's feet until they revealed the location of the jewelry, the money, and so on. And when the chauffeurs got what they wanted, meaning the jewelry and the money, did they leave? No. They would party, and they would drink everything there was to drink, eat everything there was to eat, trash everything, and then leave. People lost everything. Their feet were burned, their home destroyed, and their savings wiped out. There were real gangs roaming the country like that.
That doesn't really exist anymore today. There aren't chauffeurs like that now.
Chauffeurs, no, but we've seen saucissonneurs recently, for example, at Bernard Tapie's place, yes, or in some Parisian apartments. People in those cases are looking for something. They know very well that people keep their money in banks these days, but they'll tie you up, they'll torture you to get, for example, the personal identification number code for your credit card.
Okay, so then they leave with the credit card to withdraw money, or how do they...
Usually, there are several of them. Once you give them a number, one goes to the automated teller machine to withdraw money. But the others stay there to make sure it's the right code. And if you gave the wrong code, obviously things could go badly.
Okay, so do they usually let her live or leave?
Usually the person is alive but seriously traumatized.
Of course.
Seriously traumatized.
There's an investigation that I found really interesting as well, which is actually mentioned a bit in the book. That's especially the case with Kilgore.
United States, early 1900s. Here is Kilgore. A violent modern case, a justice system that looks and communicates differently. A portrait that says everything about the difference between the French police and the American police.
What's happening in this case?
We're in the United States, and what's interesting,
It's later, right, I think, too?
we're now in the 20th century, starting in the mid-1970s and continuing to the present. And what's interesting here is that even though we're in the 20th century, when they're looking for this Kilgore, the American police and the FBI don't have an anthropometric photo. Because basically, he's a student, more of an intellectual, who hasn't had any run-ins with the law. He simply joined a group that can be described as terrorist, which is actually the first far-left terrorist group in the United States. The famous Symbionese Liberation Army, it's a small ultra-leftist group that resorted to violence in the mid-1970s. They will kill, they will rob banks, and they will kidnap the famous Patty Hearst, who is the heiress to a real media and publishing empire. And not only will they kidnap and hold her captive, not to demand a ransom for themselves, but to force the Hearst family, who were very wealthy, to distribute food to the needy throughout California. And Patty Hearst, who will be held captive and also indoctrinated by this far-left group, will end up joining them and robbing banks with them. And so obviously this will really shock America. The young woman, the wealthy heiress being searched for, who suddenly appears in the surveillance footage of a bank she's robbing with her kidnappers in a way. So this is a case that will really, how should I put it, preoccupy America a lot in the years 1973, 74, 75. Europe will also debate the well-known Stockholm Syndrome. How the person who is a victim of a group will end up becoming a member of the group by embracing the cause, in a way, in the name of which they were kidnapped, and after all, their parents were held for ransom. Still, it's an incredible story. And so Kilgore will become part of this movement, the Symbionese Liberation Army then. He is pursued by the FBI first across the United States, but they can't find him.
Did they find the other people from the group?
Many will be killed, actually. There will be a pretty violent assault, and most of the group members will be killed. Others will try to hide. Kilgore is one of those who will slip through the cracks, so the FBI will have a wanted notice for decades, with photos of him, but photos that were gathered from search after search from his family at his home. So student photos, photos with a wool hat, basically photos of everyday life in a way. And we can't find him. And actually Kilgore managed to leave the territory of the United States. From there, he went to Africa. He had a second life, let's say, as an educator, first in Zimbabwe and then in South Africa. And it was 25 years later that he was arrested in Cape Town, South Africa. He was identified, extradited, and set to be tried in the United States, but much time had passed. He spent a little time in prison, but in the end, not much, and he is still alive today. And he became an academic. He published 3 novels. He published a book about incarceration. He stayed strongly left-wing, but stopped using violence. And what's really amazing is this wanted poster, which is completely different from the usual FBI wanted posters, where you have mugshot-style anthropometric photos and criminals. Here, we have an intellectual with glasses, pictured at different times in his life, who managed to stay on the run for about 20 years.
And today, is he living? Is everything okay?
Well, he's an old man now. He's calmed down a bit. And then his ex-fiancée from the Symbionese Liberation Army, who also was on the run for a very, very long time, recently became known for publishing a cookbook. So there you have it. They're old leftists who have calmed down and now have a somewhat different life.
Okay, yeah.
And who have a somewhat different life.
Later, you also talk about the Philiponet case. What's actually happening in that case?
So the Philiponet case is interesting because that's where the photos lie. That is to say, Philiponet in his photo has a horrible face, really the face of a killer. And his victim has the face of a good guy, calm, okay? And his victim is not just anyone. In fact, he's the head of forensic identification, so that department of the police prefecture that takes photos of criminals.
He's the victim? That's wild.
There you go. And actually, how should I put it? So, the head of forensic identification goes to the courthouse, since his offices are in the attic of the courthouse in Paris, the old courthouse on the Ile de la Cité. He arrives in the morning to work. Someone hides behind a column and emerges. It's Philiponet, who simply draws his gun and shoots him. So, you have to imagine a crime at the courthouse, right inside the courthouse itself, involving the head of a department from the police prefecture. So it's a sensation, and the photo of Philiponet is terrible. So it's going to be published in the newspapers, and people will say, he's a psychopath, a madman, who murdered Mr. Bale, the head of forensic identification. So with Philiponet, there's no doubt about his guilt. Additionally, he is promptly arrested at the courthouse.
Yeah.
Well, and he's going to be sentenced to life at hard labor, so he leaves, he goes to the penal colony. At the trial, some journalists do a bit of research and realize two things. It's that Philiponet, sure, he looks terrible, but that's after the crime, the arrest, the interrogation. If you visit his neighborhood and talk to those who know him, you'll see he's an honorable man, respected by all. He's a war veteran, he was decorated.
Had they already found Philiponet at that point?
No, but he's arrested immediately after killing him in the courthouse with judges and police present.
Yeah.
He's in the lion's den.
All right.
He's arrested right after he kills.
Okay.
After that, he's placed in pretrial detention as we try to understand what happened and his motives. And when he goes to trial, the journalists who have also done their investigation, including in his neighborhood, realize that in fact he's a well-respected petty bourgeois, a decorated war veteran who has, it's just that he has a problem with, how should I say, collecting rent. He was a victim of Bale, who, in addition to his police prefecture duties, had acted completely illegally.
So he's the victim, right?
The victim, the head of forensic identification, to make ends meet, had started a company that did expert analyses, which he absolutely had no right to do, of course, as a civil servant, and he was selling his expert analyses, and in the dispute between Philiponet and the owners of the premises, well, he did a completely botched analysis, which as a result made Bale lose his case, made Philiponet lose his case and ruined him. And so, in fact, he's a man who's completely desperate, ruined by a dishonest expert who comes to take his revenge. I'm not saying it's right to take revenge by killing, but there are some mitigating circumstances. Philiponet is not a habitual criminal, he's someone who just snapped. And the victim, despite his calm and respectable appearance, was actually quite corrupt and rather vile. And despite that, well, Philiponet's trial will never be reviewed, and Philiponet will be sent to the penal colony, and he'll die there.
It's crazy, really, how you never actually know what's people's real motive, or what's really hiding behind this kind of act in the end.
That's what's interesting about these cases. Sometimes there are several possible interpretations. And it's true that if we just focus on the guy's physical appearance, on the expression in the photo, it's actually very limited. The photo itself is interesting, either for identifying someone we're looking for or for placing someone socially. But the shape of the face or the facial expression never indicates that the person is a murderer or is dangerous. That's entirely different. We're all potentially dangerous. Each of us can at some point give in to an act of violence, even extreme violence. If we're afraid, if we're angry, it threatens us. So, whatever the shape of the face, the color of the eyes, the shape of the skull, the photo is useful when you're tracking someone, yes. But you can't predict it. There are no crime chromosomes, criminal bumps, or killer faces.
Has there ever been a photo that really struck you? I mean, even when you were preparing the book or something, one where you thought, damn, their face shocks or scares me.
Well, there are some photos that I actually find moving.
Yeah.
For example, he has a photo that's extraordinary. It actually looks like a picture of a pre-war movie star. It's the photo of Jean Wehler.
Okay.
Jean Wehler is a Parisian who lives in the upscale neighborhoods on Chalgrin Street next to Avenue Foch. She's the daughter of an industrialist. She's never worked a day in her life. She lives off the interest, you know, the interest. She lives off the family fortune. Being the 1920s, she has even more fun. She's a regular in Paris nightlife, often seen at trendy clubs, bars, and top restaurants. By the end of 1928, she's on her third husband. She's well dressed with a fur collar, a cloche hat, impeccable hairstyle, and that's how she'll be photographed by the police at the end of 1928. Why? Because in their ultra-chic building on Rue Chalgrin, 3 gunshots are heard in the middle of the night. And actually, she shot her husband. So the police step in, arrest her, and try to understand what happened.
And was she dressed like that when she shot him?
Yes, she is. They were returning from a party. Here's what happened. It's that the two of them used to go to parties, balls, and grand cafes. We're in the Roaring Twenties, so it's really the time when Paris attracts the whole world with its shows and performances. Champagne flows freely, it's the Roaring Twenties, and they're loving it. They specifically visited the famous Bal Negre on Blomet Street. There you can hear jazz, you can see dancers, whether they're American, Caribbean, African, and so on. The husband bets a friend he can pick up the black singer, leaving his wife behind. At that point, she feels like that's really going too far. On top of that, the singer sees a well-mannered, wealthy gentleman who's interested in her, so she joins the group. They go to a few more bars around Montparnasse. Well, at this point, the woman is fed up, and when they get home, there's a couple's argument. Well, we can understand, but it's going to end very badly. So in the press, the first comments will be terrible. Especially L'Humanité, at a time when the communists are very, very revolutionary, which will say it's a tragedy of bourgeois corruption, she's a depraved woman, etc.
Yeah.
And then it turns out that the husband himself wasn't exactly innocent either, meaning he was also on his 3rd wife. The 2 previous wives who divorced him testified that he was a real pervert who pushed them into prostitution and was a bit of a voyeur. He engaged in complex erotic games. Moreover, Jeanne Wehler had 2 children from a previous marriage and was in conflict with her husband. The husband, who was clearly seized by some kind of fit of madness, was threatening to go after his children, who were sleeping in the apartment on Rue Chalgrin, and so she will say that she also fired to protect her children from her husband's fit of rage. Either way, the husband is devastated. First, she shoots him twice, wounding but not killing him. While he's on the ground, she approaches and shoots a 3rd bullet into his ear. At that point, it's just execution.
Yeah.
But there are these circumstances, maybe not extenuating, but at least to be taken into account, like the madness or semi-erotic madness of this husband. We'll share all kinds of slightly risque anecdotes about him. And then, above all, Jeanne Wehler is defended by a great lawyer, Master de Moro Giaferi, who was Landru's lawyer. He's a leading figure of the bar between the wars, and so she's going to go to prison, but it's a relatively, in the end, relatively light sentence compared to what she did. They'll decide she's not so guilty after all. This case will help mark the end of the Roaring Twenties. Here, you sense the party is over, the couples, the games between whites and blacks, the late-night parties until 3 or 4 in the morning, all ended. She is tried at the end of the year 1929. We move on to something else. That's what's interesting too with all these news stories. For historians, it's often through the news story. A news story succeeds in the press when it captures the spirit of its era. And here we really have the shift between the Roaring Twenties and what will soon become the Dark Years.
Yeah. Was it normal at the time, by the way, to have a gun on you like that, or at home?
Normally, you need a gun permit.
Yeah.
I don't think that gun was owned illegally.
Okay.
She wasn't walking around with a gun, but since they were at home, there was a drawer with a gun in it. I recall the gun belonged to the husband, not her, who was a former soldier. He said he was wounded and had a trepanation during the war. It later turned out that he had probably made that up, but that could excuse the kinds of fits of madness or the oddities, the eccentricities he had, the kinds of episodes, a bit of excitement and madness he could have. So, well, some people kept weapons at home. You're not supposed to use them to settle marital disputes.
That's clear. There was a case I found really interesting while doing a bit of research on that period. It's especially the Bono Gang. I don't know if that rings a bell for you?
Bono Gang, December 21, 1911, Paris, Rue Ordonnay, 10 a.m. A car arrives. 4 men with Brownings shoot at a cash courier in France's first motorized robbery. Jules Bonneau, Octave Garnier, Raymond Callemain, René Vallée. Anarchists who use cars when the police still only have bicycles. Between December 1911 and May 1912, they spread terror. March 25, 1912, Chantilly robbery, 2 dead, 47,750 francs stolen. April 28, 1912, Bono is surrounded in Choisy-le-Roi as 40,000 watch the siege. 4 hours of gunfire leave the house destroyed and Bono dead from bullets.
The Bono gang is one of the great classics, and especially Bono, who was a car driver at a time when it was a rare profession, and the first to have the idea of using a car to steal. And he's the one who invented the holdup. The holdup wasn't invented in the United States, it was invented on Ordonez Street in Paris. And so the Bono gang between 1911 and 1912 will stun the country. They were initially called the Automobile Bandits, even though they didn't own a car since cars were very expensive then. They're more like luxury cars, but actually they steal them and use them, either to rob a cash courier, that is an employee carrying a bag full of money, or to outright attack banks like the Société Générale in Chantilly. And they leave with the loot.
So does that mean that back then, if they didn't have a car, what did they do? Did people leave on bicycles? Did they run away? How did it actually work when there were robberies?
Yes, people would run away and often got caught. So the idea of using a car is even more brilliant because at that time the police hardly had any cars. There's a famous editorial cartoon showing the Bono gang escaping by car. In the car's bodywork reflection, you can see a cop on a bicycle trying to catch up with them. Well, indeed, at first, the police are completely helpless. That's why special squads called Tiger Brigades will be equipped with automobiles. But that's, in a way, an effect of the Bono gang. At the time of the Bono gang, the criminals had a technical advantage over the police. They found a way to escape quickly. Additionally, because these cars are stolen, they can't be tracked. Even recording the license plate, which is required, only shows the vehicle is stolen. With the Bono gang, you must also consider that besides their crimes, mainly robberies, there's an ideological aspect. That is to say, they claim to be anarchists. They are illegalist anarchists, meaning not only people who reject social law, representation, and elections, who believe everyone should live their own life and pursue full freedom, but as a result, they believe that property is theft and that they have the right to steal. One can step outside the law to live freely in a way.
Okay.
And so there will be a curious mix, how should I put it, of both far-left activism and, well, pure and simple delinquency with gunfire. And they'll also get the idea when they drive off to fire shots in the air. So basically, you could say it doesn't serve any purpose, but actually it scares the population. And so, as a result, the first testimonies will be very difficult for the police to collect, because the people who witness the scene obviously run away, are shaken, are destabilized by these gunshots that aren't aimed at them, but create such an atmosphere that the testimonies at first are very, very unreliable. However, the police response, under the authority of Prefect Lépine, will be terrible, since many members of the Bono gang will be literally shot down, and the last survivors, those who are arrested, will be guillotined. The gang will be dismantled quickly, but for 2 years it will still make newspaper headlines. And today we realize that they were the ones who invented the holdup.
What kind of robberies are these? Do they target people, banks, or something else?
It's banks. So on Rue Ordonez, it's a messenger boy. It's an employee who has a kind of uniform and who transports funds. But he carries them in a satchel that's attached to his jacket by a little chain. It's not an armored truck, you know, it's a person who walks on foot with, and generally these people, since they wore a uniform with that little chain, they were respected. It was very rare for someone to attack a cash courier. And then, just as he arrives in front of the Société Générale branch, which still exists, you know, on Rue Ordonez, the bandits show up, rush at him, grab the bag, shoot, and leave with the loot, with the cash courier wounded. Later on, there would be real robberies. That is, the car would park in front of a bank branch like in Chantilly. The bandits enter the branch, hold up the employees, take the money, the valuables, everything available in the branch, and leave immediately with it. Besides, to have cars, they have to steal them, and in some cases, they're stolen while they're parked. In at least one case, the car is stopped while driving, suggesting a roadblock was set up. The driver stops, the driver is threatened, the passenger as well. They're put aside and the bandits leave with the car, which they'll use for the robbery. That's a lot of violence overall, and they'll pay for it dearly. And then there was an episode much later, which is quite incredible. It's that Dr. Locard, who is one of the fathers of forensics in France, he's French, but he has distant Scottish ancestry. One day, in his laboratory in Lyon, much later, he receives Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, the Scottish novelist as well. He shows him his facilities and everything he uses to study crimes scientifically. So of course this fascinates Conan Doyle, and then Conan Doyle suddenly freezes, sees a photo, an anthropometric record with a photo of Bono. And so Locard doesn't understand. He says to him, well, yes. And Conan Doyle says to him, but that was my driver. And it turns out that indeed Bono, in his youth before the Bonnot gang, lived for some time in England and was a driver for a number of people, probably including the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
That's crazy, that's incredible. There's one last case I wanted to maybe address before we get to the end of this episode. I think this one's actually pretty big. First of all, we have a rather harmless looking face. It's the Landru case. So what actually happened with this case in the end?
Landru, a monster with an ordinary face. April 12, 1919, Paris, Rue de Rivoli. A woman recognizes a short, bald, bearded man who looks completely harmless. Henri Désiré Landru is arrested on his 50th birthday. In his notebook, 283 women, widows he met through personal ads between 1915 and 1919. At least 10 disappeared after following him to Gambay. Landru always purchased 2 tickets, round trip for himself, one way for them. Their bodies, never found, were burned in his stove, sentenced to death on November 30th, 1921, and guillotined on February 25, 1922. His last words were, "That, sir, is my little baggage."
The Landru case is an absolutely incredible story because at first Henri Désiré Landru, that's his real name, was just a small-time crook. He was someone who wanted to be an industrial engineer, but he came from a very modest background, a rather working-class environment. He didn't go to school, so he lied. He pretended to be an engineer, an industrialist. However, he was a good mechanic and even an inventor. He filed a patent that I found at the National Institute of Industrial Property, the National Institute of Industrial Property. In 1899, he filed a patent for a kind of motorized bicycle. He had the idea to take a bicycle, add a fuel tank to it, and a small engine. So in a way, Landru was a bit of a pioneer in soft mobility. So he patented this motorized bicycle. He even built a prototype that still exists, and he tried to market it. And since in 1900 there was the Great World's Fair, he went looking for investors, but it didn't work out. So he decided to use his invention differently, through scams. He would place classified ads suggesting people partner with him, help him rent a place, and so on. Some people lend him money or give advances, but each time he disappears with it. So it's a small-time scam, relatively petty. At first this was back in the 1900s. He realizes that he's quite a handsome man with a good-looking face, a bit devilish, a bit red-haired, with a small goatee and so on, that he has a certain success with the ladies, and so the female savers, the widows who have a little nest egg, are all the more receptive because they get along well. All right, and so he gives up industrial fraud to move on to marriage fraud. He plays the seducer with lots of little gestures. He brings a bouquet of flowers, some chocolate, he has tea, he chats, he listens to these women. He's not the type to show off. He's a seducer who understands that you have to let your target do the talking. So he listens to these women, tells them they're right, and sympathizes with their little misfortunes. In short, he becomes the indispensable man. And since he usually targets single women, in the end, when he starts talking about marriage, well, why not? And he even makes them dream of a new life in the colonies in America. And he has a small country house. So the idea is to retreat a little to the countryside and then go to Le Havre to catch the boat.
Yes.
And strangely enough, well, all these women disappear. And this will happen, especially during the First World War, so between 1914 and 1918, at a time when the police aren't dealing with minor crimes at all, because the police are fully mobilized for counter-espionage during wartime.
Well, yes, of course.
Plus, we're in a Paris with very few men. Young men, those of age to serve, are at the front under the flag, while Landru, who is approaching 50, is no longer eligible for mobilization. So he's a well-dressed man in a very feminine Paris where he's going to make a big impact. He will seduce many women. Now, what he's looking for isn't sexual at all, because Landru, by the way, is married. He's even the father of 4 children, and he wants to provide his family with the lifestyle he believes an industrial engineer should have, even though he isn't one. And so, in fact, he's going to seduce women just to rob them, plain and simple. So he only comes home irregularly, bringing money to his wife to feed the children, maintain the house, and so on. And it's the women's money, it's the money from the women he seduced that made him disappear. Sometimes, of course, since we're leaving for America.
So what does he do eventually?
And so these women he seduced, who arrive at his country house in Gambay with their jewelry, their money, who gave him power of attorney to empty the bank account, since they're going to leave for abroad or the colonies, well, they disappear. In fact, we don't really know exactly how he killed them. It's assumed that he strangled them in their sleep, then he cut them up and probably burned the identifiable parts, like the hands and the head, in his little stove. Around Gambays, there are ponds, forests, and many spots to scatter body parts. In any case, almost nothing was ever found of those victims. There was simply an inspector named Belin, who conducted a pretty thorough investigation and eventually caught Landru. He was someone who belonged to the special brigades, the Tiger Brigades, and he was a bit surprised because he was informed of 2 disappearances that were very similar. And he had the impression that it was probably the same man who was behind both disappearances. Based on that hypothesis, he began a remarkable investigation, visiting the families of the missing women, including one woman's sister. And the Tiger Brigades have the telephone. That too is a new innovation for the police. And one day she runs into this bearded man who was her sister's boyfriend when she disappeared. She calls Belin, who arrives. The man made a purchase. He left his contact information. He left a business card with the name Fremier, so he's going to arrest this Fremier. And thanks to anthropometric measurements, they'll realize that this Fremier is none other than the conman Landru, who was arrested a few years earlier for minor scams.
That's right, yeah.
And then, by investigating more and more thoroughly, they'll realize that 10 women, plus the young son of one of them, have completely disappeared. So, until the end, Landru will claim he's innocent, but he will be sentenced to death and guillotined. And it's said that before being guillotined, he supposedly said to the barber, since you know they would shave the necks of those condemned to death, he supposedly said to the barber, "Give me a fashionable haircut. I still need to please the ladies." Since he was almost bald, that's really dark humor, very dark.
Wow.
Landru is also interesting photographically, because when you see his mugshot, you can't understand how this man was such a seducer, because that photo was taken almost a month after his arrest, so there's a month of pretrial detention. There are all the interrogations. When you find photos of Landru before his arrest, there you see a completely different face. You see a man who is much more charming and who had all the right manners to lure into his net women who, in fact, became victims of a serial killer. But not a sexually obsessed serial killer, a serial killer interested in money. He even dealt in second-hand furniture. He would come to the house with a handcart, take the furniture and knickknacks, and then go sell them.
And do we know in the end the total fortune he took from these women? Or estimated? Is it a few hundred euros, a few thousand?
It's hard to estimate since he resold these goods and his family depended on them. So, you have to imagine that the belongings of the missing people were used to house, feed, and clothe a family of 6 for 5 years.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. That's actually quite a lot, honestly. It's a lot. Bruno, as we near the end of this episode, I thought we could briefly revisit this book before finishing. What is it actually about for those who might not have followed at the beginning of the video? So, is it portraits of assassins? Does it tell stories?
The idea is to go back to photography in judicial investigations, how from the invention of photography in the 19th century, magistrates and police officers started to take an interest in it. How they used photographs to identify victims, to find criminals, to capture crime scenes, and how in the end, a stock of thousands and thousands of photographs was built up, giving us today the faces, the looks, the clothes of all these people who were arrested, whether they were guilty or innocent, by the way.
There are already a lot of them, by the way, in the book. You should know that for those who don't know, we've maybe talked about, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 cases. Honestly, there were so many that before we started, well, while we were preparing the episode, I had to contact my casting manager to find out which cases we could cover.
Of course.
Exceptional. Bruno, thank you so much for taking part in this episode. It was super interesting. I thought it was really cool. So this was Noah. For those who want to take part in another episode, just a reminder that there's an email showing up right here. You can maybe send a little summary of what you've experienced, or if you're an author or whatever, don't hesitate. Have a great evening. Bye.